Hi, everybody. Hank Preston here, back once again, along with...
Hey, Snackers. This is Kareem Iskander. Welcome to another episode of Snack Minute. Today, we're going to talk to you about AppDynamics and AppDynamics Cloud with our guest, Alec. Alex, do you mind introducing yourself?
My name is Alec Chamberlain. I've been with Cisco for about 9 years now, and I'm currently working as a TME in the AppDynamics business unit.
Tell us what we're going to cover on AppDynamics today.
So today what we'll do is we'll walk through standing up a Kubernetes cluster. I will have already done that piece of work because it does take a little bit of time, but we'll call it out as one of the steps. Then we'll dive into the actual installing our cluster monitoring for our AppDynamics Cloud solution. And then we'll go through monitoring an application that's been deployed within that AppDynamics cluster. Once it's up and running, then we'll interact with that website, generate some load on the application itself, and then actually dive into the different metrics that are being collected when you have AppDynamics enabled in the cluster.
All in 10 minutes?
All in 10 minutes, I'm hoping to. Let's see how these live demos go. So you know how that can be sometimes.
I'm excited to see this because it's always that bit. We see demos and hear about AppDynamics and these observability tools, but it's like, well, what do you have to do to actually get to the point where you can get data out of it? So I'm excited to see this first part of the demo, as well as the later stuff too. So jump right into it, Alec.
So right, as I mentioned, I have already installed a Kubernetes cluster. In order to do that, I have made use of EKS, Amazon's Elastic Kubernetes service. What this allows us to do is elastically spin up and down the cluster based on size and workload. So for this, what I've done is I've created a cluster of 5 different nodes. You can see here that they're all in a ready state, so we can interact with this cluster. Our CNI has been deployed, and we should be able to send data. Let's check our pods just before we get started. So nothing's been installed, a completely bare cluster here. So the first thing that I would do is I would come down here to our AppDynamics Cloud GUI, and then I would navigate over here to the configure panel. Under here, you will find Kubernetes and APM. So we'll go ahead and click that. And under this screen, we'll have the ability to configure our data collectors. And the process is extremely simple, right? So all we're going to have to do is simply input a name for this set of credentials. I'll call this CVF K8 Cloud 2. And then I will just copy this name into the next input box. Now below this, we have some additional configurations that we can enable. We're definitely going to want the cluster collector at a minimum, as well as the infra collector so that we can view different host metrics of things like CPU, memory utilization, disk I/O. And then finally, the log collector as well. Enabling the log collector allows us to collect Kubernetes logs that are running within the cluster. So very similar to a Splunk-like feature. However, it doesn't have the in-depth granularity where we're picking out specific things, right? It's truly just to help you go through the mass amount of logs that Kubernetes may produce based on each service.
Are those logs from the underlying Kubernetes infrastructure, or are they from the applications running on the cluster, or both?
All of the above, actually. And we also have the ability, let's say your log format doesn't conform to the ones that we have in our log tool here. We have the ability to write custom grok expressions in order to actually extract that log data out. So what I'll do here is I will download the operators file and I will download the collectors file here. Then I will navigate back to our console here. And the first thing we will do is we're going to create a namespace for our collectors and our log collector and everything. So let's go ahead and do that. Create namespace AppDynamics. So simply with the kubectl create ns AppDynamics command, we've now created our namespace.
For those watching that are not familiar with Kubernetes and kind of some of the pieces that are here, what's the namespace do and why are you creating one and not just use kubesystem that seems to be already there?
Correct. So kubesystem's typically for the default configuration. So this is going to hold things like kubeproxy, your DNS pods, as well as your CNI, your container network infrastructure nodes. Kubesystem's really for that infra, right? Now, AppDynamics is separate from that. And one way of logically breaking down a Kubernetes cluster is to have a namespace per application. There are a couple ways to skin that cat, but that's a very common way. So I'm really just following that best practice here by putting the AppDynamics application, really just the monitoring suite, right? It's not a user app, an end user app, if you will, into this namespace. And then our actual user app will be in its own namespace as well. And when we go to configure the monitoring, how we actually instantiate the agents and the auto-instrumentation on our application pods is by annotating on our namespace.
And snackers, don't worry about it if you're not following through with any of this. We have some great content on Cisco U. If you check out some of our Kubernetes tutorials on u.cisco.com, we cover exactly what are the different pieces of Kubernetes, how to deploy it, and that part that Alec hasn't really got into for you. So, head over there.
So now we have the namespace created. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to stand up something known as Cert Manager. So this is, again, going to exist in its own namespace and is an application to create TLS certifications that ensure our connection between our Kubernetes cluster and our AppD Cloud instance is actually secure. Now, of course, you could create your own custom certs with your own CA or an external CA. But most customers or people doing this in the lab are not going to have access to this. So Cert Manager removes that by automatically creating these certs and making sure that they're up to date and available for use within the cluster. Installing it is very simple. The command is actually provided to you in the AppDynamics GUI and as well in my article on Cisco U. So we'll just go ahead and send that off here. It'll go out and create all the necessary things needed for Cert Manager to work within the cluster. And then we'll just validate that it's actually running within our Kubernetes cluster here. So you can see here, we have 3 different pods that were spun up. One is not in a running state. I'm sure it'll come running once I actually issue the command again. So I'm going to go ahead and proceed here. This is the output that I expect. At this point, we're now ready to begin deploying AppDynamics pods. So in order to do that, AppDynamics has written a few Helm repositories. Now, Helm is an automation tool within Kubernetes that makes inputting all the different variables and configurations into YAML files. So your deployment YAML, your pod YAML, services, all of that is automated for you. So instead of copy and pasting, for example, our URL to the AppD instance 6 times into all the different pods that it needs to be copied into, Helm does that automatically for us. So we will go ahead and send that here. I've added the Helm repo previously through a different installation time. Your output will be different, but this is what I'm expecting for my environment. The next thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and install our AppD operators. Now, what I will need to do is update the file. So if you remember back when we were working within the GUI, we downloaded 2 different files, the operator values.yaml and the collectors.value.yaml. So what I will need to do is just point this at the path to this. Where am I? I'm in T-story. Point this at the path to our file here. And then we will go ahead and issue this command. Now, if you'll note at the end, there is a flag for -- wait. It is expected for this to take a little bit of time. So we'll just let this run in the background.
So while we're waiting for it to go through, so you're deploying the operators, and then what was the other one? Collectors, do I remember right? Can you explain
That's correct.
What the difference between those two are?
Yeah, sure. So our collectors are the one that are, as the name might imply, collecting data within our Kubernetes cluster. So this is things like our infra collector, our log collector, and the overall just cluster collector. The operator is what is managing those collectors overall. So really the operator, one way to think of it is the operator is the gatekeeper for us sending our data upstream, whereas our collectors are actually working within the cluster to collect different metrics and data from our applications and the hosts themselves.
That makes sense. And I think that that's one of the things that I've noticed with a lot of these more modern types of applications and things heading in the cloud native is very kind of compartmentalized microservice style approaches. And so they're 2 different pieces, each one of them responsible for their own part of the larger task. So
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about microservice architecture, right, the idea is to separate out the different tasks. No longer are you supposed to create a Docker container that's a Ubuntu image and then install all your .debs on it. That's not really the intention of Docker. Sure, it works, but the point of it was to have a lightweight instance just executing essentially one action, maybe two, depending on the design of the app. So you'll see that throughout Kubernetes and really anything AppD Cloud. So looking at the output here, looks like we have successfully installed our operators. We'll go ahead and check what has actually been pushed to the cluster at this point. And it looks like we have our 3 pods here existing in our AppDynamics namespace. So we can go ahead and proceed at this time, and we will add one more Helm repository. This is for our operators and clouds. It is separate from our previous repository, so there are 2 different Helm repos that you need to ensure are installed on your system when doing this. And then we will go ahead and issue our next Helm install command, and I will point this at my downloads folder. That actually looks to be the same command. I apologize. We'll put it here, downloads. And then we will run that command. So there's no -- wait here. I imagine that this should complete pretty quickly, which it has. So let's go ahead and check the different pods that have been created. So you can see here that we have spun up all of the different collectors. So we have our cluster monitoring pod, our infra monitoring pod, our log collector, and then our OTel collector. You'll note that one pod has been brought up for each node within the cluster. So we have 5 different nodes in this cluster. You would have 5 different log collectors or 5 different OTel collectors for this deployment. Now, at this point, we're ready to actually install our application. However, I'd like to pause and just take a second to go back to the GUI and see what's been created, or if we're actually seeing any data at this point. So in order to view data that's being sent to the AppDynamics GUI, what we'll do is we'll come up here to the Observe tab, and then this should open up into all the different options of domains that we are monitoring. Now, at this point, we don't have application performance monitoring set up, but that'll be our next step. What we did set up is our Kubernetes cluster monitoring. So if we come down here and click into the different clusters, we should be able to see all of our clusters if it doesn't have the filter there. So if you remember back to when we inputted our credential configuration, I had named this cluster CVF K8 Cloud 2. This was not existing prior, but now that we have deployed our operators and our collectors, you can see here that our cluster has appeared within the GUI. Now, the reason we don't have any data at this point is because the collectors have not been collecting for long enough. So typically after 5 minutes, we should have some data being populated, but typically I like to wait an hour when doing any demos. So for example, for this, I was interacting with a different cluster that I have running alongside this one to actually populate data. So if you come up here to the CVF K8 Cloud, you can see here that we're actually populating memory utilization, CPU utilization, just all the great host level information and metrics that you can get from a Kubernetes cluster.
So, Alec, this looks very familiar to some functionality that you see within Panoptica. Could you just talk to us a little bit about what's the difference between leveraging this in AppDynamics as opposed to having it in Panoptica?
This is actually making use of Panoptica data. So when we talk about things like Cisco Secure Application or this host level monitoring, we are pulling in that data from our other services to actually populate here in the AppD Cloud. Now, this becomes a larger play. So for the roadmap for this product, right, with FSO, we plan to be able to connect all of these different data domains in order to correlate with actual business risks or business outcomes. So if you can see the light at the end of the tunnel, this is the start of building that full stack observability solution for you. So at this point, we've got our Kubernetes cluster monitored. And the next thing that we'll do is we'll deploy an application into our Kubernetes cluster, and then we'll go ahead and monitor that. I am in the directory to install my application. I have a Kubernetes deployment file here. It is written in YAML, and this contains all of the different pods that are associated with this application. It will also stand up an ALB within AWS so that we can interact with this application just through the web browser.
ALB would be the load balancer for those that aren't familiar with the term.
Just like we had done for our previous applications, I'm going to create a namespace for this. So I will, again, use the kubectl create namespace command, and we will call this namespace tstore because our application is a tstore. So we've created our namespace. Now, the next thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to actually annotate this namespace. So what I'll do is I'm going to just quickly change into another directory so I can get the command. So with this kubectl command, I'm annotating the namespace tstore with our specific syntax to inject our Java OTel sidecar, which will allow us to actually monitor the application running within our Kubernetes cluster. The important thing to note here, right? My entire app is written as a Java app, so I can do this bulk annotation on the namespace. But if you had an application that had a Node.js front end and a Java back end and Python for some other service call or data processing, you would need to go into your actual Kubernetes deployment file and add the annotation on each deployment pod or however you want to get the monitoring done. So it is a little more granular. It is not as straightforward as I'm making it seem here, but it is just as simple as applying an annotation and it will automatically work for you. So we'll go ahead and send that off. I have successfully annotated the namespace tstore, at which point we can now deploy our application into our namespace here. So let's go ahead and do that.
Can you add the annotations and the monitoring to an existing application? And then Kubernetes would kind of redeploy with monitoring, or would you have to remove the application and then kind of redeploy from scratch?
So I had actually kind of built that into the demo here. Yes, typically in order to re-trigger the monitoring of our OTel sidecar, you would have to actually remove the application from the cluster and then redeploy it. It's a one of the pods here. So if I come up here, you can kind of get that. Our cluster mon should be monitoring that cluster. So when it sees that change of the pod being deployed or undeployed, then redeployed, on the redeployment, it would know to trigger a scan and see if there are the annotations in place. If you do it prior, you're essentially just doing it out of order, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So let's get our application deployed. Store YAML in our namespace of tstore. And once we send that off, you should see a bunch of deployments and services being created, and we can check to see that those are running. They should come running. So because this is a brand new cluster, it's actually having to go through and pull the images. They weren't available in the Docker repository here, but we'll give it a sec and everything comes running again. So this is what I expect. And at this point, right, you would think that we'd be monitoring our application, but we're still missing one thing, one very important thing. So what I'll do is I will create one more file here and call this vi hotel inst YAML. I will paste this here. This file is available on our AppD docs. It's also available within the tutorial that I had written for Cisco U. All this says is use the latest Java sidecar and the specific URL to actually send that data within the cluster. You don't have to make any changes, edits, just simply copy and paste and put it into the system. I will go ahead and deploy the OTel inst. I will deploy this into the AppDynamics namespace. So in order to view that our sidecar is actually running within our cluster, one quick way to view that is to describe your application pod. So in order to actually describe the pod, you would issue the kubectl describe command, and I would expect to see environment information here. You can see that it's not. So what I will do is I will delete my tstore application from its namespace. We will let that clear out. So now that the app is out of here, we can go ahead and redeploy it. And at which point I would expect for our OTel monitoring to actually appear. Now, one thing that we should do is we should generate some load on the application. So once it's working, right, I would expect to find my application running here under the application performance monitoring and the services. You'll see here a nice application flow diagram connecting all of the different services for your application. We have multiple apps being monitored, so that's why you see a couple different clusters here within the GUI. But the one that we are looking at is the tstore application here. So we can actually dive in and see different metrics and alerts that AppDynamics has automatically, right? I haven't configured any health rules for this. There's no limits or levels, thresholds to be configured. It all just pops in and works. Looking at the output here, if we take a look at our cluster, it's red. So why don't we dive in there and investigate why that may be? In the past 5 minutes, we've had 2 different health rule violations. And if we expand that out, you can see here that our Kubernetes deployment, the number running versus the number desired is out of state, right? Something is wrong there, and we've identified it as a critical warning.
This has been really cool to see, Alec. I think that what's exciting about this, and this may be something that we can bring you back for a later Snack Minute to dive deeper into what we could do with this information, like how does an operator troubleshoot it, take actions on that. But being able to see kind of the prep part was really nice to be able to go through on that. So thank you so much for joining Kareem and I here on the Snack Minute video. As a first-time guest here on Snack Minute, we've got a bit of a question that we like to ask our guests. So if you could tell us, if you could have one superhero power, what would that superhero power be?
If I had any superpower, I'm a very tall guy, I would choose to be able to teleport so I don't have to travel and fly on planes.
Teleport. This is one of our favorites here at Snack Minute. Alec, this has been very informative. Thank you so much for your time. Snackers, a lot of what Alec has covered here is in Cisco U, so head over to the link below and check out some of his tutorials. And thank you guys, and thank you Snackers for your time. We'll see you next time on Snack Minute.